Shadows in the night. It was just after sunset when Mrs. Hilda Jones, 68 years old and set in her ways, saw the black car glide down Evergreen Lane once again. The purr of the engine was as smooth as silk, quiet but noticeable enough in this sleepy suburban neighborhood. From the vantage point of her large bay window, she sipped her lukewarm tea and adjusted her binoculars. She'd noticed the strange nightly routine 2 months ago, and every passing evening only stoked her curiosity further. A young man with crisp suits and polished shoes was always behind the wheel, a man who seemed far too out of place here among retirees, dog walkers, and parents ferrying kids to soccer practice. His name was Daniel Wolfe, a former real estate mogul whose rise to success was the stuff of neighborhood gossip. Once celebrated for donating scholarships and fixing up local schools, he'd vanished from the public eye, and no one had a clue why. But the biggest mystery wasn't Daniel's appearance, it was the presence of a little girl. Hilda noticed the child each time. A petite thing with cocoa-colored skin, thick curly hair, and a red ribbon she always wore, tied neatly at the top of her ponytail. Her clothes were always spotless, and the bright sundress she wore tonight, a cheerful shade of yellow, stood out starkly against the worn leather interior of the luxury car. Together, Daniel and the girl drove to a rundown storage unit at the end of the street, right where the neighborhood's charm gave way to an abandoned lot that most people avoided. The garage, once used for car repairs, was a sad shadow of its former self, its paint peeled away in flaky streaks, the windows cracked and stained with grime. Hilda could barely fathom why a millionaire would bother coming here every night, let alone bring a child along. Something didn't add up. A familiar stranger. Hilda wasn't the kind of woman to let things go. In fact, she had built a bit of a reputation for being the unofficial watchwoman of the neighborhood, always ready with a complaint about noise violations or misplaced recycling bins. But this situation was different. This wasn't just her curiosity talking. Something about the way the girl clung to Daniel's hand stirred a feeling Hilda couldn't quite explain. Was it fear? Sadness? The old woman leaned closer to her window, trying to catch another glimpse before the garage door swallowed the pair into darkness. Daniel always drove in, parked the car inside, and pulled the rusty roller door shut behind them. Then, silence. No music, no lights left on for anyone to see through the cracks. Just shadows and secrets. The neighbors were beginning to whisper about it too, though nobody seemed as concerned as Hilda. Rich folks are weird, they'd say with a shrug, brushing off the odd behavior like it was just another eccentricity. But Hilda's gut told her otherwise. She knew what it looked like when people were hiding something. Years of living with her late husband's gambling habit had given her a nose for buried truths. And this smelled like trouble. Clues in the details. For 2 months, Hilda kept meticulous notes. She knew the exact time Daniel's sleek black car rolled onto their street, 8:30 p.m. sharp. She knew that the child, whom she began calling Rosa in her head, because of the red ribbon, never smiled. The girl always stayed close to Daniel, her expression guarded and her eyes distant. And every morning at 6 a.m., the two of them would emerge from the garage, the man looking exhausted in the same suit, the girl's dress still immaculate. Hilda had tried stepping outside a few times, pretending to take out the trash or water her plants, hoping to catch their attention. But Daniel never lingered long enough for conversation, and the girl clutched his hand tighter whenever someone came near. It was as if they were avoiding everyone. But why? Theories and doubts. Hilda's mind raced with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Maybe Daniel was in some kind of trouble, running from debts or an ugly scandal. Or worse, maybe the little girl was in danger, caught up in something no child should ever experience. Was Daniel hiding her? Had he taken her from someone? The questions gnawed at Hilda's thoughts long after the garage door slid shut each night. The neighbors remained skeptical. "You're reading too much into it, Hilda," said her friend Margaret over coffee one morning. "Daniel Wolfe isn't a criminal. He probably has some business to take care of. But Hilda wasn't convinced. This wasn't just business. No one handled business out of an abandoned garage with a child in tow. She tried mentioning it to Tom, the friendly old postman who lived next door. Tom chuckled, brushing her concerns aside with a wave of his hand. Millionaires are just weird, you know. Maybe the garage has sentimental value or something. You remember how he used to buy up old properties for restoration projects? Maybe, Hilda thought. But why was the little girl there? And why would someone like Daniel, who could afford anything, spend his nights in a dusty, forgotten space that smelled of oil and mildew? A strange encounter. One evening, Hilda decided she had to act. The next time Daniel's car appeared, she left her window perch and shuffled outside, clutching a flashlight. She told herself it was innocent. She'd just take a stroll, maybe get a closer look at what was going on inside the garage. After all, if no one else was going to ask questions, it was up to her. The car slowed as it approached the garage, Daniel's sharp blue suit glinting briefly in the twilight. As he stepped out and opened the passenger door, Rosa climbed out, holding his hand without a word. There was something protective in the way Daniel placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, as though shielding her from the world outside. Hilda pretended to fumble with her flashlight, hoping they might notice her and offer some sort of explanation. But Daniel glanced her way only briefly, a polite nod, but nothing more. His expression was calm, unreadable, as if he carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. Before Hilda could think of what to say, Daniel guided Rosa inside the garage and shut the door behind them. The first clue. Determined not to give up, Hilda waited until the car was parked inside. She walked closer to the garage, heart pounding, and pressed her ear against the cool metal door. For a moment, there was only silence. But then she heard it, a soft humming. It was the sound of Rosa's voice, faint but clear. She was humming a lullaby, one that Hilda recognized from long ago, a tune her mother used to sing when the world felt heavy. Something about that simple song struck Hilda deep in her chest. What was this girl doing here? And what kind of life had led her to hum such a sorrowful melody? Hilda stepped back from the door, suddenly unsure of what to do. She couldn't deny what she felt anymore. Something more complicated than suspicion. It was worry. And beneath the worry, something else. An understanding that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than met the eye. Unraveling the mystery. The next morning, Hilda woke to a gray dawn, her thoughts still tangled in the haunting lullaby she had overheard. The melody stayed with her, looping in her mind like a persistent whisper. She brewed herself some coffee, hands trembling with more than just age, and decided it was time to take action. If no one else was willing to look into Daniel Wolf's strange behavior, she would. After all, Evergreen Lane was her home, and she wasn't about to sit idly by while something suspicious brewed under her nose. A visit to an old friend. Hilda knew that if anyone had information on Daniel Wolf, it would be Sharon, a real estate agent who had been handling property sales in the area for decades. Sharon knew every house, every buyer, and every piece of gossip tied to the neighborhood. Hilda pulled on her coat, grabbed her walking cane, and headed down the block to Sharon's office. The little bell above the door jingled as she entered, and Sharon looked up from her desk with a welcoming smile. "Hilda, it's been a while. What brings you here today?" Hilda returned the smile but wasted no time on small talk. She sat down and leaned in close. "I need some information about Daniel Wolf. Do you know what he's been up to lately?" Sharon raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Daniel Wolf. Haven't heard that name in months. The last thing I knew, he sold off most of his property, got out of the game. Said he wanted a break from it all." "Did he buy that old garage on Evergreen?" Hilda asked. Sharon shook her head. "No, that garage has been abandoned for years. Daniel doesn't own it. At least, not officially." She paused, tapping a pen against her chin. "Come to think of it, I heard something strange a while back. Daniel's younger brother, Mason, passed away recently. Tragic story. Left behind a daughter. The pieces clicked in Hilda's mind like tumblers in a lock. The little girl must be Mason's daughter. Do you know the girl's name? Hilda pressed. Rosa, I think, Sharon answered. Mason didn't have much, certainly not enough for a child. Rumor has it that Daniel took her in, but he didn't want the public to know. Something about avoiding legal trouble with the girl's estranged mother. That bit of news only deepened the mystery. Why would Daniel hide Rosa? And why shelter her in an abandoned garage instead of his own mansion? It didn't make sense. Thanks, Sharon, Hilda said as she stood up, her thoughts swirling. Be careful, Hilda, Sharon warned, concern flickering in her eyes. Daniel's been through a lot. He might not appreciate you poking around. But Hilda's curiosity was now a blazing fire, and nothing could stop her from uncovering the truth. A new plan takes shape. That evening, Hilda decided to get closer than ever. She wouldn't just observe from a distance. This time, she would sneak around the back of the garage and see what was happening inside. She knew it was risky, but something about Rosa's quiet demeanor tugged at her heart. Children shouldn't live in the shadows. She waited until dusk, her heart pounding as she watched the familiar black car roll down the street. Daniel parked outside the garage, and as usual, Rosa followed close behind him. The little girl's yellow dress fluttered in the breeze, the red ribbon in her hair like a flag of quiet defiance. Hilda crouched low, hidden behind the thick hedges that ran along the back of the garage. She could hear the low rumble of Daniel's voice inside, calm but firm, though she couldn't make out the words. Then she heard Rosa's soft reply. Do you think we'll ever be safe? There was a pause. Daniel's voice dropped lower. Soon, kiddo. I promise. Just a little longer. Hilda's heart clenched. Safe from what? The words were innocent enough, but the tone in Daniel's voice carried a weight that made her skin prickle. She adjusted her position, pressing herself closer to the cracked window at the back of the garage. She peeked inside, careful not to make a sound. What she saw startled her. A room of secrets. The garage was nothing like she expected. Instead of cluttered junk or piles of tools, it had been carefully transformed into a makeshift living space. There were sleeping bags neatly rolled in the corner, a small shelf filled with children's books, and a battery-powered lantern glowing faintly on a table. A portable heater hummed quietly in the background, warding off the evening chill. On the far side of the room, Daniel was sitting on an old sofa, holding a sketchbook open in his lap. Rosa sat beside him, drawing quietly with a pencil. The scene was oddly peaceful, almost domestic, like a father and daughter sharing a quiet moment before bedtime. And yet there was an air of tension, an unspoken fear hanging in the air like a cloud. Hilda pulled back from the window, her mind racing. Why would Daniel and Rosa be hiding out here like fugitives? And then it hit her. Daniel was hiding Rosa from someone. Whispers from the past. The next day, Hilda reached out to an old contact, Detective Morrison, a retired police officer who had been a friend of her late husband's. If anyone could dig into the situation without raising suspicion, it would be him. Morrison met her at a small cafe on the edge of town. His salt and pepper beard and weathered face gave him an air of quiet authority. You've gotten yourself involved in something complicated, haven't you, Hilda? Morrison said with a chuckle as they sipped their coffee. Hilda gave him a pointed look. I need to know what's going on with Daniel Wolf and that little girl. Can you find anything out for me? Morrison leaned back in his chair thinking. I remember the Wolf family. They were in the news a while back. Daniel's brother Mason had a messy custody battle with Rosa's mother. She lost custody, but there were rumors she didn't take it well. So Daniel's protecting her from the mother. Hilda guessed. Looks that way, Morrison said, nodding. But if they're staying off the grid, it's probably because the mother isn't just a threat. She's dangerous. Hilda's heart skipped a beat. She knew now that Daniel wasn't just hiding Rosa out of fear. He was keeping her alive. The final straw. That night, as Hilda stood at her window once more, watching the black car glide into the garage, She felt a mix of emotions: relief, guilt, and overwhelming concern. She now understood that Daniel's secrecy wasn't about shame or scandal. It was about survival. But that knowledge came with a burden. If Rosa's life was truly in danger, Hilda couldn't just sit and watch anymore. She had a decision to make. Shadows in the past. Hilda knew there was no turning back. She had learned too much to walk away. And now every fiber of her being urged her to help Daniel and Rosa. But helping without understanding the full truth could be dangerous. The more she thought about Morrison's warning, that the girl's mother was not just angry but potentially dangerous, the more determined she became. What if Rosa wasn't safe even now? What if danger was closing in faster than Daniel could see? That night, as the streets of Evergreen Lane lay quiet under the soft hum of streetlights, Hilda sat at her kitchen table, tapping a finger against her teacup. A storm of questions rumbled inside her mind. Where is Rosa's mother? Is she still looking for the girl? Why hasn't Daniel gone to the police? And most urgently, how long could they keep hiding before everything fell apart? Her curiosity had carried her this far, but now she was tangled in something far more complicated. This wasn't just neighborhood gossip, it was life and death. She needed more than whispers and guesses. She needed facts. A reckless choice. The next day, just before dusk, Hilda pulled on a dark coat and laced up her shoes. Tonight, she wasn't going to just peek through windows or linger on the edges. She would get inside the garage and confront Daniel Wolfe. She had seen enough over the past weeks to know the routine. Daniel and Rosa would enter the garage at night and leave only at dawn. If she could catch them in that brief window before the door locked behind them, she might finally get the truth, whether Daniel liked it or not. Hilda waited until she saw the black car glide silently down the road, its sleek exterior gleaming under the streetlights. She crouched low behind the neighbor's hedges, heart hammering in her chest as Daniel parked by the garage. The soft click of the car door opened, and Rosa stepped out, clutching the small stuffed rabbit to her chest. They disappeared inside, and just as the rusty garage door groaned shut, Hilda darted forward. The cold autumn wind stung her face, but she didn't stop. Before the door fully closed, she slid her cane between the frame and the metal, halting it with a jarring clang. The noise echoed in the quiet street, and Hilda winced, realizing she might have just blown her cover. For a moment, everything went still. Then the door inched open from the inside. Daniel's face appeared, sharp and suspicious. His deep-set eyes narrowed when he saw Hilda standing there, her hands clutching her cane like a lifeline. "Mrs. Hilda," he said, his voice low and edged with caution. "What are you doing here?" Rosa peered from behind him, her large brown eyes filled with both fear and curiosity. "I could ask you the same thing," Hilda said, straightening her back despite the ache in her joints. "Why are you hiding out here, Daniel? And why is this little girl with you?" Daniel sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what it looks like," he muttered. "Then tell me what it is," Hilda said firmly, not backing down. "You know as well as I do that secrets only grow heavier with time." Daniel hesitated for a long moment. Then, perhaps realizing that there was no point in lying to this determined old woman, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "Come inside, but you need to understand. The less you know, the safer you are." Inside the refuge, the interior of the garage was even more unexpected up close. The walls were lined with boxes labeled with strange symbols, and a large world map hung on one side of the wall, red circles drawn around specific locations. A battery-powered lantern glowed warmly in the center of the room, casting flickering shadows over the strange objects spread across a cluttered table: documents, cash, burner phones, and passports. It looked less like a hideout and more like a safe house for someone on the run. Daniel closed the garage door behind them and leaned against the wall, his expression weary. Rosa curled up on the couch, holding her stuffed rabbit close. "You want the truth?" Daniel asked, rubbing his temples. "Here it is. I'm not just hiding Rosa from her mother. I'm hiding her from people who want to use her. Hilda's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Use her for what? Daniel gave her a hard look. Her mother, she's involved with a dangerous crowd. Criminals. When she lost custody, she made some bad choices, and now those people want Rosa, not for love, but leverage. If they find her, they'll use her as a pawn. Hilda gasped, horrified. But why are you doing all of this alone? Why haven't you gone to the police? Daniel let out a bitter laugh. You think I haven't tried? The police won't help, said it's a domestic matter. They don't understand what kind of people we're dealing with. If they knew where Rosa was, they'd take her straight to child services, and it wouldn't be long before those criminals found her. So you've been running, Hilda whispered. Yes, Daniel admitted quietly. And this garage, it's just a stop along the way. We move every few weeks to stay ahead. The weight of his words settled over Hilda like a heavy fog. This wasn't just about hiding from a vindictive mother. This was about staying alive. A dangerous revelation. Hilda looked at Rosa, the girl's small figure illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern. Rosa's tired eyes told a story of endless goodbyes and silent fear. No child should have to live like this, Hilda thought. She turned to Daniel, her voice steady. You can't keep doing this on your own. You need help. Daniel shook his head. It's too dangerous, Mrs. Hilda, if you get involved. I'm already involved, Hilda interrupted firmly. I've been watching you for weeks, and I'm not going to stop now. If you're running out of options, then let me help you. Daniel stared at her, torn between gratitude and fear. You have no idea what you're getting into, he warned. Maybe not, Hilda said. But I know one thing, you can't fight this battle alone. And neither can Rosa. Rosa looked up at Hilda, her small voice barely above a whisper. Do you really want to help us? Hilda knelt beside the little girl, her heart breaking at the vulnerability in Rosa's eyes. Yes, sweetheart, she said softly. I promise. A plan in motion. Hilda's mind whirled with possibilities. If Daniel couldn't go to the police, maybe there were other ways to protect Rosa, ways that didn't involve hiding forever. She knew people in the community, old friends who still owed favors, and Morrison might know someone who could help off the books. But Hilda also knew that time was running out. If the people after Rosa were as dangerous as Daniel claimed, they would eventually find them. Caught between shadows and light, Hilda's house felt eerily quiet as the three of them sat around the kitchen table, their nerves fraying under the weight of the situation. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound, every second like a reminder that time was slipping away. Do you have any kind of plan, Daniel? Hilda asked, folding her hands on the table. Daniel glanced at Rosa, who sat quietly beside him, hugging her stuffed rabbit, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. He exhaled through his nose, his exhaustion palpable. I thought moving every few weeks would buy us time. I never expected it to stretch out this long. And now they're getting closer, Hilda murmured, her brow furrowed. You're out of places to hide, aren't you? Daniel gave a grim nod. Yes, I found out yesterday that they've traced us to this area. They'll figure out where we are soon if we don't leave by tomorrow morning. The air seemed to grow heavier at those words, and for the first time, Hilda saw the full weight of Daniel's burden. A man fighting a battle he couldn't win alone, carrying the responsibility of a child's life with no backup, no safety net. Desperate measures. Hilda took a deep breath, her mind racing. She needed to think fast, and she needed to think smart. You can't just keep running forever, Daniel. If they're finding you this quickly, it's only a matter of time before you run out of luck. I know, Daniel admitted quietly, his hands clenched into fists on the table. But what choice do I have? If I go to the police, they'll hand Rosa over to child services. They won't understand how dangerous this situation is. Hilda tapped her finger on the table, thinking. There had to be a way. A network of people, some loophole, anything to buy them more time. Then it struck her. Morrison. He had mentioned earlier that Rosa's mother wasn't acting alone. There were people backing her, criminals who had influence far beyond the reach of a simple custody dispute. "We need someone who knows how to work outside the system," Hilda said. "Someone who can help without drawing too much attention." Daniel raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "You know someone like that?" "Maybe," Hilda said. "There's a retired cop named Morrison. He's a bit rough around the edges, but he knows things. He's seen the worst the world has to offer, and he still believes in doing the right thing. If anyone can help, it's him." An unexpected visitor. Just as Hilda finished speaking, a sudden knock at the door made them all jump. Daniel's hand went instinctively to his jacket, where Hilda noticed for the first time a glimmer of metal, a gun tucked discreetly into his waistband. Rosa stiffened, clutching her rabbit even tighter, her wide eyes darting between Daniel and the door. "Stay here," Hilda whispered, rising from her chair with deliberate slowness. She grabbed her cane, her heart thudding in her chest as she hobbled to the door. The porch light buzzed faintly, illuminating the figure standing outside. To her relief, it was Morrison. He tipped his hat when she opened the door, though his usual smirk was replaced with a look of concern. "Mrs. Hilda," he said, his voice low. "I need to talk to you. Now." Hilda glanced over her shoulder at Daniel and Rosa, then stepped outside onto the porch, closing the door behind her. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Morrison leaned closer, his expression grim. "I've been keeping an ear to the ground like you asked. Things are worse than I thought." Hilda's stomach dropped. "How bad?" "They're coming," Morrison said. "And they're not just looking for the girl. They're after Daniel too. Word is, someone put a price on his head. This isn't just about custody anymore. This is a manhunt." Running out of time. Hilda's pulse quickened. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Morrison said. "A day at most. Maybe less." He hesitated, glancing toward the closed door. "Mrs. Hilda, you're a good woman, but you're in over your head here. These people aren't the kind you mess with. If you're caught helping them, there'll be hell to pay." Hilda squared her shoulders, gripping her cane tightly. "I'm not going to abandon them, Morrison. I can't. There's a child involved." Morrison gave her a long, hard look, then sighed. "All right," he said. "I'll help, but only because it's you." He pulled out a small piece of paper and pressed it into her hand. "Here's the address of someone who can get them new identities. It's not cheap, but it's the only way they'll have a chance." Hilda unfolded the paper and studied the address. This was their way out. A race against the clock. Back inside the house, Hilda relayed Morrison's plan to Daniel. His jaw tightened as he considered it. "New identities. I don't know if we can afford that." "You can't afford not to," Hilda said. "It's the only way to keep Rosa safe." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn. "We'll need money. I've burned through most of what I had trying to keep us hidden." Hilda's mind worked fast. "I have some savings," she said. "It's not much, but it should be enough to get you started." Daniel shook his head. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," Hilda said firmly. "I'm offering. Now let's get moving. If Morrison's right, we don't have much time." Packing up and moving out. The next hour was a blur of movement. Hilda, Daniel, and Rosa packed what little they had into a single duffel bag. Rosa stayed close to Hilda's side, her small hand gripping the old woman's fingers as if she were afraid to let go. Daniel loaded the bag into the car and double-checked the fuel gauge. "We need to leave within the next 20 minutes, he said. Morrison said they're already in the area. Hilda knelt beside Rosa, brushing a stray curl from the girl's forehead. "We're going on a little adventure, sweetheart," she whispered. "But don't worry. I'll make sure you're safe." Rosa nodded solemnly, her small face etched with a seriousness far beyond her years. The final roadblock. Just as they were about to leave, the sound of tires screeching down the street froze them all in place. A black SUV came to a halt at the end of the block, its windows tinted and engine rumbling ominously. "They'd found us," Daniel whispered, his hand inching toward the gun in his waistband. Hilda felt her heart skip a beat, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We're not going to fight them," she said. "We're going to outsmart them." She turned to Daniel. "Take Rosa and go out the back. I'll buy you some time." Daniel hesitated. "Hilda." "Go," she said, her voice firm. "I'll be right behind you." As Daniel scooped Rosa into his arms and disappeared through the back door, Hilda took a deep breath and stepped outside onto the porch, ready to face whatever came next. A narrow escape. Hilda stood on the porch, the cool night air brushing against her skin as the black SUV idled at the end of the block. The sound of the engine growling softly reminded her of a predator stalking its prey. She had only minutes to draw their attention and buy Daniel and Rosa time to escape. Taking a deep breath, she gripped her cane tighter and limped down the front steps. She had no plan, just sheer will and the determination to do what needed to be done. If they want a confrontation, they'll get one, just not the one they expect. The driver's door swung open with a metallic creak, and a tall, burly man stepped out. He wore a leather jacket, and his cold, calculating eyes scanned the street. Another man stepped out from the passenger side, leaner but no less dangerous. They didn't look like police. They were bounty hunters or mercenaries, and their every movement screamed of violence, held barely in check. Hilda raised her hand in a casual wave, forcing a smile. "Evening, gentlemen. What brings you out this late?" The men exchanged glances, not bothering to hide their suspicion. The taller one stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement. "We're looking for someone. A man and a little girl. Seen anything unusual around here?" Hilda tilted her head, pretending to think. "Now that you mention it, I did hear some noises out back not long ago. Thought it might be those raccoons again." She jabbed her cane toward the alley running alongside her house. "You might want to take a look." The two men hesitated, and for a split second, Hilda's heart raced. If they took the bait, Daniel and Rosa could get away unnoticed. But the shorter man narrowed his eyes, sensing something off. "We'll check," the taller man said, jerking his head toward the alley. The shorter one shot Hilda a warning glance before following. As soon as they disappeared around the corner, Hilda shuffled back into the house, her heart pounding. She hurried toward the back door, praying that Daniel and Rosa were already gone. Through the shadows, Daniel held Rosa close as they slipped through the overgrown backyard, the night cloaking them in shadows. They had no time to waste. The men would search the alley and realize quickly that Hilda had lied. "This way," Daniel whispered, guiding Rosa toward the gap in the old wooden fence. Beyond the fence was the neighbor's yard, which opened onto a narrow side street, their only shot at getting to the car unseen. Rosa clung to him, her tiny fingers digging into his shoulder. She was quiet, but Daniel could feel the tension radiating from her. "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" She whispered in his ear, her voice small and fearful. "We'll be fine, baby," Daniel murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We just have to be quick." They slipped through the gap and crouched low behind a row of hedges. The side street was empty, but Daniel knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They needed to move fast. He looked back toward the alley, half expecting to hear shouts or footsteps at any moment. "We're almost there," Daniel whispered, glancing at Rosa with a reassuring smile. "You ready?" She nodded, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. "Ready." An unseen threat. They darted across the side street, Daniel's heart thudding in his chest. He scanned the area as they moved, his senses on high alert. But just as they reached the car, a third figure stepped out from the shadows. "Going somewhere," the man sneered, blocking their path. Daniel's blood ran cold. This man was different, taller, sharper, with eyes that gleamed like a predator's in the dark. He had been waiting for them, anticipating their move. Rosa whimpered, and Daniel instinctively pulled her behind him. "Stay back," he warned, his hand slipping under his jacket to grip his gun. The man chuckled, taking a step closer. "Relax, Harrow. I'm not here to hurt the kid, but the people I work for. They won't be as kind if you don't hand her over." Daniel shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Not a chance." The man shrugged, as if he'd expected that response. "Suit yourself. But this little game ends tonight. There's nowhere left to run." The cavalry arrives. Just as Daniel prepared to draw his weapon, the sharp blare of a car horn split the air. Headlights cut through the darkness, and a familiar vehicle roared down the street. Morrison's battered pickup truck. The mercenary cursed under his breath, stepping back just as the truck screeched to a halt beside them. The door flew open, and Morrison leaned out, his eyes blazing with determination. "Get in," Morrison barked. Daniel didn't hesitate. He scooped Rosa into his arms and threw the duffel bag into the truck's bed. They scrambled inside just as the mercenary reached for his gun. "Go, go," Daniel shouted. Morrison slammed his foot on the gas, and the tires squealed as the truck surged forward. Bullets whizzed past, but Morrison didn't slow down. The truck barreled down the narrow street, the mercenary shouts fading into the night. A temporary reprieve. They drove in tense silence, the only sound the rumble of the engine and Rosa's soft breathing as she clung to Daniel. Morrison didn't speak until they were miles away, deep into the city's industrial district. "We'll lay low here for a bit," Morrison said, pulling into a dimly lit warehouse parking lot. "They won't think to look for you here. Not yet, anyway." Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Thanks, Morrison. I don't know what we would have done without you." Morrison grunted, his gaze sharp. "Don't thank me yet. This ain't over." Hilda's words echoed in Daniel's mind. "You can't run forever." A new plan. Inside the warehouse, Morrison spread a map across a dusty table and pointed to a location far from the city. "There's a contact out west. He can get you papers, IDs, everything you'll need to disappear for good." Daniel nodded, absorbing the weight of the plan. It was risky, but it was their only option. "What's the catch?" "Money," Morrison said bluntly. "It won't come cheap." Hilda's voice crackled over the burner phone Morrison had handed Daniel. "I told you, I got savings. You take that girl, and you live the life she deserves, no matter what it costs." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "Hilda, thank you. I'll keep them off your trail as long as I can," Hilda promised. "But you've got to move fast. Don't look back." A father's promise. As Daniel sat beside Rosa on a makeshift cot, he wrapped her in his arms and kissed the top of her head. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart," he whispered. "I promise." Rosa looked up at him, her brown eyes wide and trusting. "You mean it, Daddy?" Daniel smiled through the tightness in his chest. "I mean it." For the first time in weeks, Rosa smiled, a real smile, and Daniel knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. The final stand. The warehouse was silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Daniel leaned over the map one last time, committing every route to memory. Morrison stood at the door, keeping an eye on the entrance. Hilda had promised to mislead the mercenaries, but Daniel knew their luck wouldn't hold for long. He turned to Rosa, who was curled up under a blanket, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm. They had one chance. A new life waited across state lines, if they could make it. Morrison's gruff voice broke the silence. "I've seen men like these before. They don't just quit. You ready for what's coming?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "I don't have a choice." Morrison gave him a slow nod, respect glimmering in his weathered eyes. "Good, 'cause they'll come at you hard." He reached into his jacket and handed Daniel a small black key fob. "When it's time, this triggers the kill switch on my truck. If you need to ditch it, they won't be able to track it." Daniel took the fob, gripping it tightly. "Thanks for everything." Morrison shrugged. Let's just get you and the kid out of here alive. Trouble finds them. The peace shattered when Morrison's burner phone buzzed violently on the table. He snatched it up, his face darkening as he listened to the voice on the other end. They're close. Hilda stalled them. But they know you're moving tonight. Daniel's heart raced. How many? 4 or 5, armed to the teeth. Morrison muttered. No more time for planning. We gotta go. They worked quickly. Morrison loaded the duffel bags into the truck's bed, while Daniel scooped Rosa into his arms. She stirred but didn't wake, exhausted from the chaos of the past few days. As Morrison started the engine, Daniel took one last look at the dimly lit warehouse. It was a graveyard of old memories and broken dreams, a fitting place to leave behind the life they once knew. A race against time. The truck roared to life, and they tore out of the lot, tires screeching against the wet pavement. The night swallowed them whole, the city's glowing lights shrinking in the rearview mirror. Morrison drove fast but smooth, weaving through side streets and abandoned industrial zones. Daniel kept Rosa close, her small hand gripping his jacket in her sleep. The sight of her peaceful face gave him strength. He would protect her, no matter what. Just as they approached the highway entrance, Morrison glanced into the rearview mirror and cursed. They found us. Daniel twisted in his seat and saw 2 SUVs closing in from behind. Their headlights blazed in the dark, engines roaring as they gained speed. They must have planted a tracker on the truck, Morrison growled. Daniel's fingers closed around the kill switch fob. You ready to ditch them? Morrison grinned, his eyes alight with defiance. Born ready. The ambush. They flew down a desolate stretch of road, the SUVs tailing them closely. Just as they neared an overpass, Daniel hit the kill switch. The engine cut out instantly. Morrison swerved to the shoulder, guiding the truck into a controlled slide before they jumped out with Rosa in tow. They took cover behind a rusted construction barrier as the SUVs roared past, unaware their prey had vanished into the night. Morrison exhaled hard, glancing at Daniel. That'll buy us a minute, maybe 2. Daniel nodded. We'll make it count. They moved quickly down the embankment, slipping into the shadows beneath the overpass. Morrison led them toward an old drainage tunnel, his flashlight casting eerie beams across the graffiti-covered walls. We take this tunnel, Morrison whispered, and we'll come out near the old rail yard. My buddy stashed a car there. Should be waiting for us. Daniel nodded, tightening his hold on Rosa. Let's move. The final confrontation. They reached the rail yard just as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Rusted freight cars stood like silent sentinels, their metal husks creaking in the wind. The car Morrison had mentioned was there, a beat-up sedan hidden beneath a tarp. Just as Daniel opened the door to strap Rosa into the back seat, a gunshot rang out. Daniel ducked instinctively, shielding Rosa with his body. Morrison spun around, drawing his pistol in one fluid motion. The mercenaries had found them. You really thought you could run, sneered the lead mercenary, stepping out from behind a freight car. His men flanked him, guns drawn. Morrison took aim, his voice calm. Back off, or you'll regret it. The mercenary chuckled darkly. You're outnumbered, old man. This doesn't end with you winning. Daniel's mind raced. He had to act fast. They were trapped, and Morrison couldn't take on all of them alone. A desperate gamble. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed the duffel bag from the truck's bed and hurled it toward the mercenaries. The heavy bag landed with a metallic clink, then exploded. The flash grenade Morrison had slipped into the bag went off in a blinding burst of light. The mercenaries cried out, clutching their eyes as they stumbled back. Go! Morrison shouted, firing 2 shots to cover Daniel as he grabbed Rosa and dove into the sedan. The engine roared to life, and they tore out of the rail yard, the tires kicking up gravel. Morrison stayed behind, holding off the mercenaries with everything he had. Freedom on the horizon. Daniel drove through the early morning fog, his heart pounding. The mercenaries were behind them, but they weren't close enough to stop them now. Rosa stirred in the back seat, blinking sleepily. "Daddy? Are we safe?" Daniel glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes softening. "We're almost there, sweetheart. Just a little farther." The fog began to lift as they crossed the state line, revealing a new landscape bathed in the warm glow of dawn. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. A new beginning. They arrived at the safe house just after sunrise. The contact Morrison had promised, a grizzled man named Hector, met them at the door. He handed Daniel a set of new IDs and a key to a small apartment tucked away in a quiet town far from the reach of their pursuers. "This is it," Hector said with a grin. "Fresh start. No more looking over your shoulder." Daniel knelt down to Rosa's level, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "We made it, baby. We're free." Rosa smiled, a real, radiant smile, and threw her arms around his neck. For the first time in a long while, they were safe. Epilogue. A promise kept. Months later, Daniel and Rosa sat together on the porch of their new home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The nightmare was behind them, replaced by quiet mornings and peaceful nights. They had found a new life, far from the shadows that had once threatened to consume them. As Rosa rested her head against his shoulder, Daniel knew one thing for certain. No matter what the future held, they would face it together, free and unafraid. And somewhere far away, Hilda sat by her window, a knowing smile on her lips. She had kept her promise.